All right, diving in today, and I think this one's going to be right up your alley, especially for our philosophy fans out there. We're going deep on the philosophy of psychiatry.
Oh, yeah. Getting into the nitty-gritty of how we think about mental disorder should be a good one. Philosophers, you guys love a good conceptual puzzle.
That's us.
Yeah.
Always up for a good head scratcher. And you've brought the perfect brain food, haven't you? I mean,
Yeah.
the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy,
Yeah.
the entry on philosophy of psychiatry, that's dense.
It is. It really is a ton to unpack there. I think our mission today is to kind of like pull out the key philosophical threads, the different ways that people have tried to define and explain mental illness. Like, what are the basic assumptions we're working with? And are there other ways of looking at this whole thing, beyond the typical medical model?
Okay, so let's start with that, the medical model. What is it at its core? I mean, I know we throw that term around a lot, but what's the
Sure.
philosophical gist?
Well, in a nutshell, it's applying a medical lens to psychiatry, right? So we're thinking about mental disorders in terms of disease, often viewing them as like manifestations of some underlying biological dysfunction, particularly in the brain.
Brain stuff.
Yeah.
But even within that medical model, it sounds like there's a spectrum of views, right? I've heard
For sure.
like minimal interpretation versus strong interpretation.
Yeah, that's the key distinction. So the minimal interpretation, it basically sees mental disorders as these recognizable patterns, like clusters of symptoms that tend to appear together and follow a certain course over time.
Kind of like if this, then that.
Exactly. If you see these symptoms, you can expect this kind of progression. And this approach really goes back to, like, Kraepelin. He was all about distinguishing different mental disorders based on these observable patterns, right? So, like, differentiating schizophrenia from bipolar disorder, for example.
Based on how they look, how they play out over time.
Yeah, the natural history of the condition, you could say.
Yeah.
And the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, kind of follows this line of thinking too, right? It defines disorders as syndromes based on these symptom clusters.
Right. It's all about checking those boxes.
Right. And for minimalists, those diagnostic labels, they're primarily tools, heuristics to help us categorize and predict. They're not necessarily claiming that these categories perfectly reflect, some fundamental biological reality, or that they're natural kinds in the truest sense.
So it's more about saying, okay, we see these things happening together consistently. Let's give it a name so we can talk about it and maybe predict what might happen next.
Exactly. It's about finding those reliable correlations in the observable stuff, right? Without necessarily making strong claims about what's going on underneath at the biological level.
Okay, so that's the minimal view, more pragmatic, focused on what we can see and measure reliably. What about the strong interpretation? That seems like it's making a bigger claim.
It is. The strong interpretation takes a much more realist stance. It argues that mental disorders are like real destructive processes happening in the body, specifically in the brain. So for the strong interpretation, a complete understanding requires, actually identifying and analyzing those underlying neurobiological systems that have gone awry.
So it's not just about describing the symptoms, it's about pinpointing the actual physical malfunctions that are causing them.
Precisely. You've got to dig deeper. And this view is often associated with folks like Heinrichs and Andreessen, who are really pushing for a classification system that's grounded in our knowledge of these brain mechanisms. They believe that real mental illnesses, they're not just like surface level symptom clusters. They reflect actual pathological processes at a biological level.
So for them, it's not just that the mind is affected, but the physical organ of the brain is actually diseased.
Right. And this perspective leads to some pretty strong critiques of the DSM. They argue that while the DSM defines mental disorders as syndromes that supposedly reflect some underlying dysfunction, it often falls short of providing specific testable hypotheses about those dysfunctions.
So they're saying, okay, you're calling it a disease, but where's the evidence? What exactly is going wrong in the brain?
Exactly. And there's this theorist named Cooper who points out that there's been some, shifting and even some inconsistencies in how the DSM has conceptualized mental disorders over the years, especially in the latest version, the DSM-5. And he sees that as a reflection of this tension between the minimal and strong interpretations within the manual itself.
Like it's trying to straddle both sides of the fence.
A little bit, yeah. And this all leads to a really fundamental question, especially for philosophy of science. What should be the goal of research in psychopathology? I mean, are we aiming for descriptive and predictive power, just establishing those reliable correlations? Or should we be striving for something more, like uncovering those deeper causal structures, even if they're hard to pin down.
Right. Are we after just the what or the why behind the what?
Exactly. And some thinkers like Poland, von Eckert, Spalding, Murphy, Gerens, they really emphasize the importance of uncovering those mechanisms, the actual causes. They worry that if we just focus on observable behavior and symptoms, we might end up lumping together people who have totally different underlying issues.
And that could lead to ineffective treatments, right? If we're treating the symptoms without addressing the root cause.
Exactly. It's like, treating a cough without figuring out if it's from a simple cold or, something more serious like pneumonia. The symptom is the same, but the underlying cause and the necessary treatment, those are completely different.
Right. You need to know what you're dealing with to treat it effectively. Okay, so this ties into the whole issue of validity in diagnosis, right? We talk about reliability, making sure different clinicians are consistent in their diagnoses. But validity is a whole other beast. It's asking, are we actually capturing something real with these categories? And that seems to open up a whole philosophical can of worms.
It does. It really does. We've got questions of ontological validity, is this a real distinct entity, this disorder? And then there's normative validity, like, is it really a pathological condition, something that needs fixing? Or is it just, a statistically unusual or maybe socially undesirable way of being that happens to have some biological correlates? It gets tricky.
It does. So even if we find, like, a specific gene or brain abnormality linked to a certain behavior, it doesn't automatically mean it's a disorder, right?
Yeah.
There's a value judgment involved.
Absolutely. And the source talks about the Feiner criteria, which were developed back in the 70s. It was a big push within psychiatry to try to establish more empirically grounded and supposedly more valid diagnostic criteria. But even then, the question remains, are we carving nature at its joints here? Are we actually identifying real, distinct categories, or are we imposing our own judgments on human variation?
It's a deep philosophical question.
Yeah.
And our source emphasizes that defining, validating, and explaining a mental disorder, those are all separate but interconnected challenges. It even brings up this interesting idea that, even if we initially define a condition at a high level, like in terms of certain thought patterns or behaviors, the ultimate explanation for why someone displays those patterns might actually be found at a much lower biological level.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It suggests that even if we start with the description of, like, subjective experience or behavior, we might end up with a biological explanation for why that experience or behavior arises.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about explanation itself in psychiatry. How do we explain these complex phenomena? The source brings up Marr's 3 levels of explanation, which come from cognitive science. Can you give us a quick rundown of those?
Sure. So Marr proposed these 3 levels for understanding how information processing systems work, like the brain. You've got the computational level, that's the what and the why level. It defines the goal of the computation, like what the system is trying to achieve. Then there's the algorithmic level, which is the how level. It describes the processes, the representations, and the algorithms that the system uses to perform that task. And finally, there's the implementational level, which is the physical level. It describes how that algorithm is actually realized in the hardware, so to speak. In the brain, that would be the neural circuitry.
So it's like, what's the goal? How do you get there? And what physical stuff is doing the work? Makes sense.
Yeah, and in cognitive science, those levels are often seen as complementary, right? Like different ways of looking at the same mental process.
But it sounds like applying that to psychiatry is a bit trickier, right? Like those levels might actually represent different kinds of things.
Exactly. That's where it gets more complicated. In psychiatry, the different levels of explanation, they might correspond to entirely different causal processes. Like, take depression, for example. The development of depression in a particular person, it could be influenced by a bunch of things, right? Like genetic vulnerabilities. That's an implementational level factor. But then there's also life events, stressful experiences, losses, those kinds of things. Those are operating at a more psychological or even social level. And it's not just that those are different ways of describing the same thing. They're different kinds of causes that are interacting and contributing to the condition.
Right. It's not like one neatly reduces to the other. It's a complex interplay of factors at different levels.
Right. And this makes it really hard to come up with a purely reductionist account of mental illness, How do you explain the impact of social isolation on someone's mental health purely in terms of molecules and brain circuits?
Yeah, it seems like you're losing something crucial if you try to reduce it all down to just the biological level.
Right, and the source also talks about this debate about what even counts as a legitimate explanation in psychiatry. What kind of explanation are we looking for?
Is any explanation good enough, or are there standards?
Exactly. And one example is this guy, Frith. He argued that to really explain a psychological phenomenon, you need to cite cognitive variables. So, like, if you find a correlation between, say, altered dopamine levels and someone experiencing delusions, Frith would say that's not a full explanation.
You need to go further.
Yeah, you need to explain how those changes in dopamine actually lead to that specific experience of delusion, what cognitive mechanisms are being disrupted. He felt like we need that cognitive story to bridge the gap between the brain and the mind.
So for him, a good explanation needs to stay within that same level of analysis, like cognitive causes for cognitive effects.
Right. He was wary of jumping straight from the brain to the experience without explaining the cognitive processes in between.
But the source mentions another view, right? This guy Campbell, who has a different take on this whole thing.
He does. He argues that we shouldn't be so quick to rule out certain kinds of explanations, He's more pragmatic. He says, look, mental illness is messy. It's caused by a whole mix of factors, biological, psychological, social, environmental, and we should be open to following the evidence wherever it leads, even if it means accepting that causes can operate across different levels.
So if we find a link between, say, childhood trauma and changes in brain structure later in life, we shouldn't dismiss that just because it's bridging different levels of explanation.
Exactly. Don't put artificial limits on what counts as an explanation.
Okay, so we've got this fundamental debate about the nature of explanation itself. What are we even looking for when we try to explain mental illness? And then the source throws another layer onto this whole thing, talking about mechanistic explanation. What's that all about?
Yeah, this is where Craver and Bechtel come in. They're big proponents of this idea of mechanistic explanation. And their argument is basically that what often gets called interlevel causation, like something at a lower level causing something at a higher level, is actually better understood as a relationship of constitution.
Like the lower level stuff is what makes up the higher level stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So like the neurons and synapses in the brain, they constitute the mind, but they don't directly cause thoughts or feelings in a causal sense. The causal relationships, according to Craver and Bechtel, happen within a level. So a cognitive process is caused by other cognitive processes, and a neural process is caused by other neural processes. It's all about the mechanisms.
But does it really capture the complexity of mental illness? I mean, we were just talking about how things like social factors can influence biology.
Right, and that's one of the challenges of applying a strictly mechanistic view to psychiatry. How do you account for the impact of, say, early childhood trauma on adult mental health in a purely mechanistic way? It seems like you need a way to talk about causation across those levels.
Right, a framework that can handle those kinds of interactions.
Yeah.
And the source brings up this idea of the interventionist approach to causation. What's the deal with that?
The interventionist approach, it's a way of defining causal relationships based on what happens when you intervene in a system. It's like, if I change this variable, what effect does it have on this other variable? So instead of getting bogged down in these debates about reductionism or levels, the interventionist approach is all about, what happens when you actually poke the system and see how it responds.
More of a hands-on experimental approach.
Exactly. And Kendler and Campbell, they argue that this framework is particularly useful for psychiatry because it allows us to test causal claims without needing to fully understand all the underlying mechanisms.
So it's a way to make progress even in the face of complexity.
Right. We don't need to have all the answers about the brain to start making sense of what causes mental illness. Okay, now the source gets into this idea of viewing disorders as statistical networks and natural kinds. And this is where things get really interesting from a philosophical point of view.
I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So this guy Thagard, he proposes that we can think about diseases, including mental disorders, as these networks of statistically based causal relationships. So instead of looking for one single underlying cause, like a gene or a traumatic event, we shift our focus to the interplay of a bunch of different factors.
That globe of influences.
Exactly. You've got genetic predispositions, environmental stressors, cognitive biases, social factors, and they're all influencing each other, pushing and pulling over time.
Yeah.
And that's what leads to the emergence and maintenance of a disorder.
So the explanation isn't a simple A causes B kind of thing. It's more about understanding the whole network of influences.
Precisely. And Cooper, she connects this idea with the concept of natural kinds. She argues that a lot of psychiatric explanations involve telling stories about what we consider to be natural kinds of illness.
So if we believe that depression is a natural kind with some underlying causal structure, then understanding how all those factors in the network interact becomes more meaningful. It's like we're not just describing random correlations, we're mapping out the causal pathways within a real entity.
Exactly. Then this leads us to Boyd's idea of homeostatic property clusters, HPCs. This is a big one in philosophy of psychiatry.
Okay, break that down for me. Homeostatic property clusters.
So the HPC view says that psychiatric disorders might be natural kinds, but not because they all share some single essential feature, like a specific gene or brain abnormality. Instead, it's because they involve a stable clustering of properties, and those properties are all kinds of things: symptoms, signs, etiological factors, course of illness, response to treatment.
So it's a whole package deal.
Right. And those properties, they're all held together by underlying causal mechanisms. So it's not about perfect uniformity across everyone with a particular diagnosis. It's more about this, family resemblance, There's enough overlap and shared causal structure to justify calling it a distinct kind.
So you might have different combinations of symptoms, different triggers, different responses to treatment, but there's still a core set of shared mechanisms that makes it a coherent entity.
Right. And those shared mechanisms, they're often at the biological or psychological level. And this framework really ties into those mechanistic explanations we were talking about earlier. It's about understanding the mechanisms that cause those properties to cluster together.
This HPC framework seems to offer a really nuanced way to think about mental disorders. It acknowledges the variability we see in how these things manifest, but still allows us to talk about them as real, identifiable entities.
Right. It threads that needle between individual differences and the idea that there are real patterns and underlying causes.
Okay, shifting gears again. The source talks about two different explanatory strategies, zooming in versus zooming out. What's the difference there?
So one way to think about it is that zooming in is all about getting more granular. Instead of trying to explain a broad diagnostic category like, say, schizophrenia, you focus on explaining a more specific phenomenon like auditory hallucinations or disorganized speech.
So breaking it down into smaller pieces.
Exactly. And this approach is championed by folks like Bentel and Spalding. They argue that we might make more progress if we shift our focus to these smaller, more reliably measurable units of analysis, like specific symptoms, cognitive deficits, behavioral problems.
I can see the appeal of that.
Yeah.
It seems like it might be easier to get a handle on those smaller pieces.
Right. And Bentel, in particular, he's been very critical of the idea that traditional diagnoses like schizophrenia actually represent coherent natural kinds. He thinks we should focus on understanding the individual components of these diagnoses rather than treating them as unified entities.
So instead of trying to explain schizophrenia as a whole, we might try to explain why someone experiences auditory hallucinations or why their thinking becomes disorganized.
Exactly. And his own work on thought disorder, for example, is a great example of this zooming in approach. He sees thought disorder as a breakdown in communication that arises from specific interacting cognitive deficits.
So a more fine-grained analysis of what's actually going wrong in the mind. What about zooming out? What does that look like?
Zooming out is more about abstraction. It's acknowledging that mental illness is complex and variable, and that those broad diagnostic categories, they're really just idealizations. They're like archetypes, capturing the essential features of a disorder. But individual patients, they're always going to be variations on those themes.
So instead of breaking the disorder down into smaller pieces, you're creating this kind of abstract model of it.
Right. It's about capturing the core disease-defining processes, even if the way those processes manifest in individual people is messy and diverse. And you see this kind of thinking in the work of folks like Murphy and Gaimi.
And they're not saying those idealizations are useless, right?
No, not at all. They argue that these models can still be really useful for understanding and predicting how mental illness works. It's just that we need to keep in mind that they're not perfect reflections of reality. They're tools for thinking about this incredibly complex phenomenon. And there's this philosopher of science, Godfrey Smith, who talks about resemblance relations between scientific models and the real world. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. The model doesn't have to perfectly mirror reality, but it should share enough key features to be useful.
Like a map,
Yep.
Right. It's a simplified representation, but it can still help you navigate.
Exactly. And Gaimi, he even defends the DSM diagnoses from this perspective. He sees them as these Weberian ideal types, which is this idea from sociology. They're like these abstract concepts that help us make sense of the world, even though they don't perfectly correspond to any individual case.
So these ideal types, they're like benchmarks, reference points that help us organize our thinking about mental illness.
Right. And this all ties into the debate about whether mental disorders are best understood as categories or dimensions.
Right, like are they distinct entities or are they points on a spectrum?
Exactly. And the source points out that both the zooming and zooming out approaches can be compatible with either a categorical or a dimensional view. Like you could zoom in on specific symptoms and still think of those symptoms as existing on a continuum of severity, or you could zoom out and create an ideal type that represents the extreme end of a particular dimension.
It's another example of how there's no single right way to think about this stuff. It's all about finding the frameworks that are most helpful for understanding and treating mental illness. Okay, I want to make sure we talk about cross-cultural issues.
Yeah.
This seems like a really important area where philosophy has a lot to contribute. I mean, given how much culture shapes our experiences, our values, our understanding of the world, how do we even begin to apply these Western diagnostic categories globally?
Yeah, that's a huge question. And it's one that has been a source of a lot of debate and controversy in psychiatry. Just assuming that our Western concepts of mental illness are universally applicable, that's clearly problematic.
Right. It risks imposing our own cultural biases on people from other backgrounds.
Exactly. And the source talks about this idea of the unificationist project, which is this attempt to find universal biological and psychological underpinnings for mental disorders, even if the way they manifest culturally can be quite different. So, they argue that depression is fundamentally the same thing everywhere, even though the specific symptoms might vary from culture to culture.
So it's like the underlying mechanism is the same, but the surface presentation is different.
Right. But then you have this other concept of culture-bound syndromes, which are disorders that seem to be unique to specific cultures. They don't really fit into the standard Western diagnostic categories.
I've heard of those. There's this one, I think it's called Coro, where people believe their genitals are retracting into their body.
Exactly. And those kinds of syndromes, they really challenge the idea that our Western categories are universally applicable. And the DSM has actually evolved in how it handles this issue. In the latest version, the DSM-5, they've moved away from the term culture-bound syndromes, and now they use this broader framework of cultural concepts of distress.
So it's not just about specific syndromes anymore. It's a more general acknowledgement that culture shapes how people experience and express distress.
Right. And they've introduced this outline for cultural formulation, which is a tool that clinicians can use to try to understand a person's mental health issues within their cultural context. So, what are their beliefs about illness? What are the cultural norms around expressing distress?
It seems like a more sensitive approach, trying to meet people where they are rather than forcing them into our Western categories.
Right. But even with those changes, there are still a lot of challenges. How do we decide how different a cultural manifestation has to be before we consider it a separate condition?
Right. That's a tough one. Where do you draw the line?
Yeah, and there's this ongoing debate about that. Some people, like Kleinman, argue that the experience of depression, for example, can be so different in Western cultures versus, say, East Asian cultures, that they might actually be different conditions. But others, like Horowitz and Wakefield, they emphasize that there are still these universal underlying dysfunctions, and that culture is mainly shaping how those dysfunctions are expressed.
So it's this ongoing tension between the universal and the culturally specific. And it seems like a nuanced approach is needed, one that acknowledges both the commonalities and the differences in how mental illness manifests across cultures.
Absolutely. And the source really cautions against this idea that Western concepts of mental illness are the gold standard, that we should be trying to fit everyone into our categories.
Yeah, that would be a kind of cultural imperialism. Okay, let's talk about how all of this actually plays out in clinical settings. How do we bridge the gap between these abstract philosophical ideas and the real-world challenges of helping people who are suffering?
Right. And the source highlights this point made by Goose, that there's this transition from the general description of a disease to the specific biology of the individual patient.
So taking those general models, whether we're zooming in or zooming out, and applying them to the unique complexity of a real person.
Exactly. And regardless of what level of analysis we're working at, the goal is to find ways to intervene to help people get better. So the models, they can help us identify potential targets for treatment by illuminating those causal relationships. But in the clinical setting, we also need to be attentive to the individual details of the person's life, their history, their experiences, their biology.
Right. It's not just about applying a cookie-cutter approach.
Yeah.
Every person is different.
Exactly. And the source brings up this humanistic perspective, which is really important. It's this idea that we shouldn't lose sight of the person's subjective experience, their humanity, amidst all of this talk of diagnoses and brain mechanisms.
Right. There's a danger of reducing someone to just a collection of symptoms or biological markers.
Exactly. We need to keep the whole person in mind.
Okay, we're almost out of time, but I want to make sure we touch on some of those alternative to the traditional medical model that the source discusses. I know these are particularly interesting from a philosophical perspective.
Yeah, this is where things get really thought-provoking. A lot of critics argue that even a sophisticated naturalistic psychiatry, one that's grounded in neuroscience and biology, might still be missing something crucial if it's overly focused on internal biological explanations.
Like it's neglecting the role of the environment and the person's interactions with the world?
Exactly. And this is where the 4E movement comes in. This idea that cognition is embedded, embodied, extended, and inactive.
A lot of E's there.
Right. But basically, it's this idea that the mind isn't just this isolated thing inside our heads. It's deeply intertwined with the world, with our bodies, with our environment. And this perspective challenges the traditional biomedical paradigm in some pretty fundamental ways.
Right, like that whole idea of the extended mind, that our minds actually extend beyond our skulls and into the world.
Exactly. And one of the classic examples of this is the thought experiment with Otto in his notebook.
Oh yeah, I remember that one. Otto has Alzheimer's, and he relies on his notebook to store and access information. So the argument is that the notebook is actually part of his cognitive system.
Right. It's functionally equivalent to biological memory. And this kind of thinking has big implications for how we understand mental illness.
Like, it's not just about what's going wrong inside the brain. It could also be about how the person is interacting with their environment, whether that environment is supporting their cognitive functioning or making things worse.
Exactly. And there's this distinction between narrow, situated, and wide theories of mental disorder. Narrow theories focus just on the mind or the brain. Situated theories take into account the immediate context. But wide theories, they include all those relevant aspects of the environment, the person's social network, their physical surroundings, their access to resources.
So it's a more holistic view of mental illness.
Right. And then you have enactivism, which is even more radical. It sees mental disorder as a disruption in the person's fundamental capacity for sense-making, their ability to interact with the world in a meaningful way.
So it's not just that their thoughts or emotions are disordered, it's their whole way of being in the world that's disrupted.
Exactly. And there are also less radical approaches within this broader tradition, focusing on things like scaffolding and niche construction. These ideas highlight how people actively shape their environments in ways that can either support or undermine their mental health. And the source also points to the growing emphasis on subjectivity and lived experience in understanding mental illness.
So it's not just about objective measures. It's about understanding the person's own perspective on their experience.
Exactly. And finally, we've got these network models, which offer a really interesting alternative to the traditional medical model.
Network models. What are those all about?
So in the medical model, we often assume that there's some underlying common cause for a cluster of symptoms, like a gene or a brain abnormality that's causing the disorder. But network models, they flip that on its head.
How so?
They say that the symptoms themselves are causally interconnected. They're influencing each other within a network.
So instead of A causes B, C, and D, it's more like A influences B, which influences C, which influences D, which influences A, and so on. It's a feedback loop.
Exactly. And this idea has a lot of intuitive appeal, right? I mean, think about how anxiety can lead to insomnia, which can then make the anxiety worse, and so on.
It's a vicious cycle.
Right. And this perspective, it challenges the traditional search for that single root cause of mental illness. But there's still a lot of debate about how different network models really are from traditional latent variable models, and whether the choice between those frameworks is more about philosophical assumptions or empirical evidence.
So, lots of open questions still. But it's clear that the philosophy of psychiatry is a really vibrant field. It's grappling with some really fundamental questions about the nature of mind, illness, and explanation itself.
Absolutely. And we've only scratched the surface today. There's so much more to explore here. But hopefully, this deep dive has given our listeners a taste of the complexity and the richness of this field.
And for you, our philosophy enthusiasts, I hope this has highlighted how important it is to engage with these philosophical issues when we're thinking about mental illness. I mean, we've covered so much ground today, from the basic assumptions of the medical model to these really radical alternative perspectives. And the point is that there's no easy answers here. It's an ongoing conversation, a philosophical journey, really.
Well said. And we want to leave our listeners with a question to ponder. Given all the different perspectives we've discussed, what do you see as the most promising direction for future philosophical inquiry into the nature of mental illness? And how can those insights actually help us to understand and alleviate mental suffering?
That's a great question to leave everyone with. And on that note, we're wrapping up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, everyone.